So welcome to today's webinar on a new world of Windows as a Service, security controls for higher education. A quick introduction into Power On Platforms and who we are. We're a Microsoft Gold partner. We're also part of the EM&S Elite Partnership Programs, which gives us some nice inroads into the guys at Microsoft. As well as then some MVPs as well, guys who are publicly recognized for all of their efforts and so forth in the community, as well as then some Power On Platform services, right? So we deal with a lot of sort of the Azure workloads, EM&S from top to bottom, System Center again from top to bottom, as well as in the Windows 10 side of things as well, not just in terms of deployment, but also the management of that as well. We've developed a couple of solutions in our time as well. The first one being something referred to as Pulse DMS. DMS stands for Device Management and Security, and it offers a sort of SaaS-based SECM experience, as well as then Camino, which is for on-premise deployments of System Center products, as well as then the smart teaming services at our disposal. So it's a managed service for device management, as well as then patch management across your servers and desktops as well. Right? So you're listening to me, Heinrich, Pelser. My job's quite straightforward. I'm part of the business consultancy team here at Power On Platforms. And my role is to understand, effectively needs in order to effectively align solutions to those and help drive businesses forwards more than anything as well, right? So today's agenda, really straightforward agenda. We're going to be looking at Windows as a Service, the ups and downs, some of the considerations we have to think about as part, obviously as part of that journey, maintaining and sort of, making sure Windows 10 stays alive and well, right? What's in the toolbox? How do we do things, once we're on Windows 10? As well as in looking at some of those desktop security bits and pieces, what's in the landscape, a glimpse of some of the possibilities and some considerations, as well as then towards the tail end of that, sharing some ways of getting started, engaging in some of these services, keeping up to date, some good, really, really good Microsoft resources at the end, as well as then, where do I start? And also talk about some of the help that Power On can give throughout this process as well. So Windows as a Service, what does it mean, and what do I need to think about? So the idea of Windows as a Service is that Microsoft have made it really, really clear there'll be no sort of future iterations of Windows. What I mean by that is there'll be no Windows 11, Windows 12, and so forth, right? You'll get new features, new capabilities, but it's all done under that Windows 10 umbrella. All right, so which effectively means for IT departments, Windows as a Service means there'll be no more big hit projects. What that means is you won't be going from one version of Windows 10 in the traditional way anymore, and there'll be a constant sort of maintenance of that platform. So there'll be no hopping from Windows XP to 7 in the same way that you did last time. So there's been no kind of sort of cataclysmic change and getting things ready and so forth, right? The idea would be that this makes it smaller, more incremental, and easier to manage in theory, right? And there are some key considerations and some challenges that IT departments have to deal with over time, as well as then users, right? And again, one of the big points of this is for users. So the idea would be to bring newer, harder and faster capability sets to your organization. Talking about things like, new ways of collaborating, productivity changes, security changes is going to be a big thing for that, right? Gaming is also another one, with obviously Xbox and Windows 10 so quite closely aligned as well. But the ultimate idea here is that there's this sort of high level of change over a sort of prolonged period of time, or indefinitely as a matter of fact, but the whole purpose of that is to enable businesses to onboard and take on new capabilities and feature sets for the foreseeable future. Obviously, in many ways, big thing for IT to consider, because they're really in charge of opening the doors of these new feature sets, capabilities and so on, as well as then at the same time having to manage them and keep the environment secure at the same time as well, right? So what are the key considerations we need to think of when we talk about things like Windows as a Service, right? It's about Windows 10, right? And the management of Windows 10 is obviously a key component of what we're discussing here today, right? So included in the Windows 10 world is everything that you bolt onto Windows 10 traditionally, right? So things like third-party apps. I'm talking antivirus, I'm talking encryption, I'm talking management tools, right? Do you have something already within your licensing, Defender, BitLocker, Configuration Manager, Intune, and so on, that you could leverage as opposed to something else you're paying for? VPNs also fall into this category as well, by the way. But the idea there would be around looking at what you already own and leveraging that to its maximum capability set for things like cost savings or cost reductions indefinitely. as well as then looking at best of breed technologies, because there's this idea of seams from a security perspective. So the idea would be that, if you layer on a third party solution to anything, that's the seam. The seam is that connection between the third party app or service and Windows 10, and typically that's where the security vulnerabilities lay, right? As well as then from a cost-saving perspective, it does make sense to look to utilize what you already own, right? The second thing then as well is around business impact and disruption. So the initial impact of the business is going to be a big one, right? So going from any operating system to another is always going to sort of have high levels of disruption in terms of changes that needs to be made. Different application sets may have to be considered, compatibility, updating, upgrading, reboots, all that type of stuff is always going to be a big thing. And obviously with Windows as a service, this is something that will be going on indefinitely. All right, so a really, really big thing to consider as part of that. Can be nicely mitigated with things like marketing, right? Internal marketing, internal communications, right? Asking for volunteers. Do the business know why IT are doing what they're doing, right? What's driving them, right? As well as in sort of the same time, sort of softly but surely getting users sort of ready for a sort of constant level of disruption in having to upgrade their Windows 10 devices. You see it with iPhones and Android phones constantly as well, right? So it is definitely something to consider as part of that as well, right? Internal impact as well to IT and support. So what do IT need to do this? Is it money? Is it tools? Is it skills? Is it time? All of those things a lot of the time as well can obviously make up that argument. But it's definitely considering and thinking about, okay, right, I have the following tools available to me. How do I best maximize the usage of that, right? Training, keeping up to date with what Windows 10 is doing in terms of changing constantly, in itself can be quite a challenge. So making sure that, you have the right resources, the right mindset and the right capability sets at your disposal is obviously then going to be key, right? User account and security changes as well. So it could be a massive leap for some users to go from a traditional domain / username password to logging on with an email address, right? We're looking at identity living in a different place if you're going to go down the road with things like Azure Active Directory, right? Things like multi-factor authentication, conditional access, the behavior of those services and what that means to end users, right? It's definitely something to consider because it will have an impact on them over a period of time, right? And then again, have we done the basics? The basics is the planning. It's the first 4 steps, right? So do we have the right tools? Have we told people why we're doing what we're doing, right? Do we have, the right mindsets to take this on? Because once you are on Windows 10, I would argue is when your Windows 10 project starts in many ways, right? Good way of thinking about this, if you ever owned a bonsai tree or a Tamagotchi, for 90s kids, you'll know exactly what I mean. It's definitely something that needs constant attention, constant button pushing, watering and feeding as well, right? To make sure it leads a happy life, right? So the other bits and pieces we need to consider is the deployment of Windows 10. I'm talking about feature updates here, right? Sort of the natural deployment of Windows 10 is also sort of natural consideration, but the deployment of Windows 10 in terms of that upgrade cycle, right? When are we going to do it? How are we going to do it? What's the impact of that? What do people expect, right? What do we expect? Do we have confidence that this will work? Do we have confidence this will go down exactly how we need it to? What level of change do we need to introduce as part of that, right? How granular do we need to be? Or are we okay with actually there's a bunch of new stuff with Cortana, we're just going to let that out, right? What's IT's perspective on that? What do we need to think about as well, right? Ongoing management for me is a massive thing. It's one of the biggest things we see within IT departments where projects definitely stumble, right? Even after they've done the initial deployment of Windows 10. The ongoing management for me is around process. It's around mindset change. And as I said, that Tamagotchi analogy is really, really true, because it is something you need to keep an eye on constantly, right? Or else, there'll be a build-up of issues, which then at the end to deal with on a year-on-year basis could definitely massively stagger IT's progress. It could also have knock-on impacts to, IT's reputation, which is going to be a big one. The second one then is user happiness. The third one being, security. What are the knock-on impacts of doing nothing, right? Or staying on a single version for too long? Because you could ironically deploy Windows 10 because you need to get off of Windows 7 for support reasons, and then find yourself back in a position where you're in an unsupported state because you haven't, have the right processes in place in order to have that Windows 10 ongoing experience there, right? You could find yourself backed into a corner, right? What I mean by that here is there something that's a blocker? What is that blocker? Identify that. It could be an application. It could be a process. It could be a change, right, that needs to happen. It could be finance. It could be technology. It could be a lot of things, right? But I suppose a lot of the times you don't really have an option these days anymore. You could look to purchase things like extended support for 7, if there is a blocker. But again, the sort of cost implications versus just going and having the right processes in place far outweigh that spend. As well, because there'll become a time where you have to get off of it. These things only last so long. So that idea of being backed into a corner, identifying those issues quite early on, right, or learning from the past anyway, will definitely stand you in good stead as well, right? Harnessing new capabilities and feature sets in itself can be a massive challenge for IT departments, right? So what I mean by that is, as new capabilities enable IT departments, right, they can also disable things at the same time in terms of going, we're not quite ready for that, we'll have to wait. Or if a new change is introduced, right, that has a knock-on impact to an app, an add-in, and so forth, right? What's the process for dealing with that? Do we need to think about things like analytics? Do you need to think about things like, app rationalization still, right? And so on and so on. All of these things, need to be considered carefully. Plus as well, introducing new settings and so forth into the environment in itself can be risky at times, because I know traditionally IT departments like to have things quite static, whereas with a constant flood of new things coming in, what's the mindset that you need to deal with that, right? What's the considerations you need to make, right, as well? So there's a lot of stuff to think about as part of that. And then finally, as well, choosing the right partner and platform, a big deal, because what I mean by that is it's also looking at, for example, is the right partner Microsoft? Is the right platform cloud? Is the right platform on premise, right? I suppose that itself depends from organization to organization, but obviously what we are seeing is that Windows 10 is very, very much built for the cloud. Still has lots and lots of ties into traditional on-premise deployments and tool sets, but it is very much something that, is cloud-centric and will forever be going that way longer term. But, so I suppose finding your sort of path to that in itself can be quite critical at the same time, right? And we are definitely here to help open some of those doors and remove some of those blockers for whatever they may be in terms of choosing, the right platform, as well as in the partner that you want to go to as well longer term. So in terms of managing Windows 10, obviously it makes the assumption that you're on Windows 10 already, and you've got 3 choices, 3 tools, quite commonly known. These are the big hitters from a Microsoft perspective. On your left, you've got SCCM or Configuration Manager, Intune as well, and then finally towards the sort of side of that, you've got Autopilot. Autopilot being the sort of one that sort of cross-pollinates across the 2 in terms of getting Windows devices up and ready and running quite quickly as well, right? So Configuration Manager, for you that know or don't know, has now come to an end. It's now referred to as Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Basically, what they've done is they've changed the name of SCCM to then effectively incorporate Intune into the mix as well. So there's a new consolidated sort of dashboard, which I'll show you, which pulls information from both SCCM and Intune at the same time and allows you to do effectively cross-platform management in that regard. The idea there is that it enables cloud capabilities quite quickly, and it gives you the best of both worlds in terms of being able to manage things granularly or fully cloud-based at the same time. And if you now have if you're an SCCM owner or you own the SCCM licensing, you now automatically have the Intune licensing for Windows 10 only. If you want iOS or Android, you still need to purchase that separately, but you do now have Intune capabilities to manage your Windows 10 environment as well, right? So let's take a quick gander at that new dashboard. So here you have it. This is that new Microsoft 365 device management portal that I was talking about. And what it's doing here in a nutshell is effectively polling information from, 2 places, one being Intune, one being Configuration Manager as well, right? So you can see a mixture of MDM devices, as well as then some desktop devices as well, right, within the Configuration Manager side of things as well, okay? So one of the things to talk about is that management of Windows 10, right, specifically the onboarding side of things as well. So if we look at, for example, device enrollment, Autopilot was mentioned there, right? So there's a couple of bits we can do here. We can configure things like automatic enrollment. We can enable Windows Hello for Business, right? There's an enrollment status page, which I'll show you guys in a moment as well. But more impressively is actually the actual deployment program, right, from Autopilot itself. What this breaks down to and the way you use it is really, really straightforward. You have effectively a collection of devices within here as well, right? Those devices are imported through a small PowerShell script you run to create something called a hardware hash. It creates a CSV file. You import said CSV file. And then off the back of that, you go ahead and create a profile for that. Now, the profile itself is really, really impressive and really, really good to show people, right? So in terms of what you can configure, right, this particular one I'll be showing you guys is user driven. So the idea here would be that you've purchased a new laptop. You could use existing devices for this as well. I strongly recommend that, by the way. The idea here is that from an end user experience, right, they get the laptop, they open it, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. But this is what IT, right, has configured in the background, right? It's a user-driven one, so I've got some inputs as part of that. What I wanted to happen here is I wanted to do an Azure AD join, right? As part of that, I'm accepting the user, the Microsoft software license terms, right, as well as hide some of the privacy settings because we as IT have already pre-configured that as well. And then the big one here, the really nice one for IT, is that it's the first time in the history of Windows we were able to kind of predetermine the sort of initial user account. So if you know anything about Windows 10 and previous versions of Windows, you would most likely need or have an administrator account on that device. Whereas with Autopilot, we can configure a standard user straight out of the box, right? We can also allow things like white glove, should we need to. White glove is effectively a way of pre-provisioning these devices with apps and settings and data, all that all pre-provisioned and then handed out as well. Typically done by an enrollment manager if you need to as well. You can also then apply a device naming template. So we'll change the host name to pull things from the serial number and so forth as well, right? But in terms of Autopilot, all it does fundamentally under the hood is do a domain join of sorts, right? And then applies the following settings you see in front of you now, right? Those settings for applications and so forth are configured elsewhere, which I'll show you in a moment as well. But the basic premise of this is that it's a nice and straightforward way of onboarding an end user straight into your environment, right? You can layer several levels of customization over the top of that, right? So if we look at the end user experience quickly, this is what he or she will see. So the idea here is that they've opened that laptop, right? There's two steps you guys didn't see. One is you pick the country you're in and the keyboard layout, right? I'll then enter my password. If I can remember to spell it correctly. So what's happening in the background now is busy setting up my device and should pop up various bits and pieces in terms of the onboarding screens and so on as well. As you can see here as well, it's busy identifying a couple of device setup bits and pieces as well. So it's found a security policy, 1 of 1 applied, and it's just doing the last of the setup now. Once it's done that, it'll obviously go ahead and reboot. Standard screens apply. Almost there. Showing us the last bits now. If I expand this, you'll see what's going on. This shouldn't take too long. And we're done. And there you have it. There's my sort of static device. It's ready to go. Should have Office installed in here as well. Let's have a quick look. Yep, I've got Office apps, I've got Excel, OneDrive, Outlook, and so on and so on. And the possibilities with this is obviously endless, right? You could customize the start screen and everything else to the nines. But the idea here is just to kind of quickly show you guys how quick and easy it is just to get a sort of end user up and running. So that was obviously getting a existing device or new device enrolled into your environment using Autopilot. As you can see, it's a super straightforward, super slick way of getting a device onboarded, as opposed to, it's more of the traditional sort of task sequences and bits and pieces you may be currently using or have previously used as well, right? But now that that device is obviously on Windows 10, right, what are the options that we have to keep it alive? All right. What I mean by that is, what can we do in terms of deploying Windows upgrades to it, these feature updates as well, right? And I'll show you some of the options you have available to you from the cloud space quickly. So give it a name. We'll call this one Windows 10 Test. It's not actually going to go out anywhere. And then let's look at some of the settings that we have to consider as part of this. So we've got a couple of options. We've got semi-annual, or semi-annual channel targeted as well. This is slightly different for 1903 devices, but fundamentally, you also then got the insider rings as well, as I recommended earlier. These are just earlier releases of Windows 10 prior to being publicly available. So some of the key options you have here is you're happy for the upgrade of Windows 10 to take place, but you may wish to block things like product updates, right? We want to control Office updates separately. We may not always want to update drivers as well, right? Quality update deferral period in terms of days, right? How long do I want to wait before I deploy my quality updates as well, right? So 15 days you could set for that. Feature update could be 60 days. The idea there is, once 19.0x or the next version of Windows 10 becomes available, please wait 60 days before obviously deploying that as well, right? We can also then have an uninstall period, a bit of a grace period for end users to go ahead, because you can also roll this back as well, should you need to, right? And we'll set that at 15 days as well, right? Ultimately as well, update or automatic update behavior. You've got a couple of interesting settings in here, to say the least. So you've got auto install at a maintenance time, right? So you can sort of say, active hours for my end users is between 8 a.m. and 5 a.m. That's the default. On certain versions of Windows, you can let the user behavior determine the active hours. As well, if you choose a different option, right? So a specific maintenance time as well. Scheduled time as well. You can say automatic behavior frequency selected is, I wanted this to install on the second week of the month. I want the installation scheduled to be on a Sunday at 6 a.m., for example, or earlier or later, depending on what you need to do as well. There's also an option in here to auto install and reboot without end user control, right? So this is just going to force the update down, install the update the minute it's available according to the settings above, and bounce the device regardless of what's happening. Bit more of a dangerous setting, but some organizations have that at their capability sets as well. You'll probably find yourself using some of the options above, right? So schedule time and so on, maybe sort of more applicable to cause less heartache within the organization. Restart checks, I would always recommend keeping this to allow. It basically checks for sort of basic things, right? Battery level, big one, display needed, presentation mode. If you're already in presentation mode, like I am now, for example, it won't do anything on my device. As well, right? So game modes, phone call modes, etc. as well, right? You can also block users from pausing their devices. So within Windows 10, the end users themselves, I'll quickly show you, has the ability to go ahead and block their Windows updates should they need to. So you can pause Windows updates here for a fixed amount of time, all right? New version of Windows is available for me as well, so I'll install that in good time. But just wanted to kind of highlight that for end users on your side. You may wish to block that so they can no longer do that. As well as then, a couple of bits and pieces in here to remind them every, 5 hours that things are happening, as well as then, remind the user prior to required auto restart as well, with permanent reminder for 15 minutes or 13 minutes in my case, or just have a permanent reminder up there saying it's going to happen, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Please save your work. You can also use deadline settings as well. As part of this as well, you specify the amount of days that you want to dictate your users use as well as in some grace periods. And then again, if you have delivery optimization configured in your environment, you can go ahead and use that, right? So in terms of deploying Windows upgrades and updates, you can see there's not a lot to it. There really isn't from the cloud perspective. It's fairly selective in what it does. Doesn't allow for a huge amount of granular management. So you'll see here, for example, that one of the big things to consider is as this new version of Windows 10 goes out, so maybe 1909, right? Luckily in 1909, there isn't a lot of change, weirdly, from Microsoft with that version of Windows. It introduced a couple of bug fixes, but beyond that, nothing drastic in comparison to what 1903 brought, and 1809 and 1803 before that, and so on. 1903 is fairly lightweight. But one thing to consider as part of this is that there may be certain levels of customization and changes that you haven't catered for in here, right? You can't do certain user settings, you can't do certain device settings, you can't do certain, anything to do with Windows. All you're doing here is scheduling the update, so to speak, right? Or the upgrade of Windows 10. So let's have a quick look at how that's slightly different within the configuration manager space, right? Doing effectively the exact same job, right? So if we go to our configuration manager instance over here, you can see that in terms of the levels of granularity, they far outweigh what's available from a cloud perspective, right? But remember, the beauty of endpoint manager is we can use both. So this is SCCM. What I showed you earlier is effectively cloud or Intune capability sets as well, right? So effectively this task sequence at the bottom, this Windows 10 Enterprise x64 this is the upgrade to. So this would be deployed to versions of Windows 10 lower than 1809, right? And as part of that, there'll be a huge amount of customizations that happen as part of these, because these are nested task sequence, right? It will disable the log-on screen, right? It will remove Edge, the desktop icon. It's going to disable Cortana, and so on as well, right? If we look at some of the security bits and pieces that we're also enabling as part of this, you can see that it's doing things within the MBAM side of things. It's installing a specific knowledge base article. It's configuring all sorts of flags as part of this as well, right? It's initializing the TPM and so on and so on and so on, all whilst it's deploying 1809. So the basic premise of this is this task sequence at the bottom calls upon all of the various task sequences above it in a specific deployment order, as well as is obviously demonstrated here as well, right? And then off the back of that, the upgrade itself happens sequentially with a high level of granular change as part of that, right? So sort of differences between the two are quite stark. The other thing you also have at your disposal is you can do and maintain a similar level of update maintenance as well. You can create these servicing plans as well. I can give you guys a quick rundown of what a generic one looks like, right? So as part of this, as you can see, you've got some deployment settings. We can use Wake on LAN should you need to. There's servicing plans as well, right? So these are just being deployed to a test collection at this point in time. Again, you've got the same sort of options here as you had before, with the exception of the insider rings you may have noticed. Upgrades here are done on a query, so to speak. So what you're saying is, I'd like to deploy Windows 10 versions 1903 and later that are not superseded and are for business in this instance as well. And then off the back of that, there's an evaluation cycle that takes place, as well as then a deployment cycle. These are being deployed as soon as possible. The user experience is also then configured here, should you need to. You've got download settings, right? Deployment options. You can allow things on a 4G connection to pull these down if they have an SCCM agent, right? There's language selections, and as well, finally, the deployment package as well that you need to select as part of this, right? So patch Tuesday, server patches, whatever the case may be. You just have that Windows upgrade as a service happening off the back of that, right? So that will then introduce that device into a plan, right? And then go from there. But you can see the sort of stark differences between the two approaches fundamentally. So one is very much geared towards a cloud, simplistic, easy to use management style. The second is far more granular, integrated as well. And then again, from an SCCM perspective, you also then have a similar look and feel in terms of that, Windows 10 servicing plans. So you can deploy them from both. They serve different purposes. Intune one for cloud, the other one being far more on-premise based as well. So if we hop back to the presentation, so if we have a quick look at that security landscape as well, right, you can see here that on the bottom of the screen, right, are these fundamentals around device protection, threat protection, identity protection, information protection, and then something new introduced these days is that post breach detection, right? So the boxes in black there is sort of where Windows 7 started the ball rolling in many ways, and where things have then been built on top of that, right? So you've got now things like virtualization-based security, as opposed to just, sort of TPM type security. We've got device guard built into the operating system, right? With things like Smart Screen and everything else still available to use, but things like Windows Defender and the firewall being massively bolstered these days, with heavy investment from Microsoft to make massive improvements on that front as well, right? Identity protection. We've started to see things like Windows Hello come into the mix. Let's get rid of passwords. Let's use biometrics. Let's use a PIN. The conversation is changing there massively at the moment with end users and how businesses are adopting that massively. But things like credential guard, the idea of storing certain credential bits and pieces within the TPM at a hardware-based level, as opposed to just, in text or on files and so forth, is a big thing as well as in doing away with passwords indefinitely. Information protection, encryption. All devices out and about should be encrypted, right? A really good solution for that from Windows 10 perspective is going to be your BitLocker, all right? We're seeing a lot of that functionality transferring into things like Intune, into things like Configuration Manager these days, right? Where central management can come from different places, but fundamentally, encryption should always be something at the forefront of any given device, right? As well as then towards the tail end of that with things like security management, conditional access, and ATA or ATP as well as part of that. So there's that post-breach detection side of things, conditional access, triggering certain things to happen based on where you are, what you're doing, what you're trying to access, right? Multi-factor authentication kicking in and so forth as well as then things with ATP and so forth, being able to really dive down deep at a granular level into any security risks, and vulnerabilities that have already taken place, hence the post-breach bit, right? Which then brings us on to some, really interesting bits and pieces that Windows 10 has transferred and changed as time goes on, right? So with Windows, things like Windows Trusted Boot, right? Stopping malware from doing anything before the OS starts, massively critical key change they've made as part of that with things like Secure Boot or Trusted Boot as well, right? Windows Hello, doing away with passwords, traditional passwords, people writing things on the back of Post-it notes and so on, getting you to use a PIN, your face, your fingerprint, etc., right? Changing the game as to how authentication happens as well, right? Credential guards, things stored in different places, right? So obviously a username password is obviously something, that can be easily taken, right, these days, but Credential Guard does its best to obviously protect that using some hardware virtualizations and basically store some bits and pieces in the TPM chip as well should it need to. And Device Guard gives you that extra level of OS hardening, right, by stopping certain bits and pieces running on your OS, right? So if it detects a system account trying to elevate a process in an Office file, or just start blocking things up, going, no, this is not expected behavior, right? IT department can naturally also black and whitelist certain processes and services as part of that, but Device Guard really does bolster that conversation, in comparison to its counterpart on Windows 7 as well, right? You then got data protection, right? So these days helping to stop leaks, accidental data leaks as well, right? Big thing we have to mitigate. We have things like Windows Information Protection, WIP, that's still part of the equation here. Azure Information Protection also falls into the play here as well, encrypting the documents at source as well as then we mentioned already Windows Defender, ATP or Advanced Threat Protection. So the idea here is, as always, is the antivirus will do its best to stop things happening in the first place, right? But once something has happened, it's understanding what has happened, why it's happened, and how to prevent that going forwards. And that's really where ATP comes into its own. So it will trigger certain behaviors, quarantining, stopping things from running, but at the same time give you a high level of granular information as to what's happened, why it's happened, and what the next steps are, recommendations are, to obviously make sure this doesn't keep happening with your environment as well, right? We'll quickly touch on these as well. They're better explained in the upcoming slides, but I just wanted to kind of raise these 3 points here. So the idea of modern security is fundamentally broken down into 3 key things, right? Protecting the front door, access control is a big one of that. We'll show you that in a moment as well. Protecting things at source, right? Where do they come from? On SharePoint, on-premise files, protecting the file as opposed to where the file lives, right, is a big thing. So you're making sure, again, you're securing the asset as opposed to where the asset resides, as well as then, detecting bits and pieces with your advanced threat security platforms and ATPs before, when, and during, an attack and a security breach as well, right? So in terms of protecting that front door. How that's broken down to is we can talk about these things like conditional access and multi-factor authentication, right? So an end user has a multitude of devices. I myself have got an iPhone, an Android phone, got a Windows laptop as well, right? I access resources on all of those. So I have certain conditions within my environment based on location. Is my device compliant? What am I trying to access, and what's my risk profile? Massively, right? Azure AD identity protection or Azure Active Directory is a massive part of that, right, as well. So being able to kind of set that conditional access to say, if Heinrich isn't within these trusted locations, right, let's ask him for a PIN or a phone call, or actually use the Authenticator app to go, that's definitely him, right? So he has, these access from multiple sides of things. How do we make sure it's definitely him? And then off the sort of back of that, if my device isn't compliant, if I don't respond within a certain time frame, access is obviously blocked, right? And if it is okay, I get access into things that I need to from my cloud apps and so on. But even that, depending on the level of access I get granted, I may be granted read-only access, right? I may be granted to change-only access. I can't move the file, so to speak, right? And so on and so on. So you can be quite granular in that approach. But fundamentally, depending on where users are and the conditions of their access, can also determine how you protect that front door, right? Protect your data against user mistakes, obviously a big one, right? So gaining in sort of access and visibility of what people are using these days. I'm talking Dropboxes, cloud storages, other apps, and so forth as well, right? Cloud app security, really, really good tool. Could show you what's happening, where it's happening, what the apps infected are, who's owning them, who's using them, and so forth as well, right? Again, massive sort of super tool within the EM&S stack that can give you really, risk scores. Heinrich's high risk because of the following conditions, right? And actually, I'm going to put the following policies in place to block him using Dropbox, or he might have a corporate one, but not a personal one, and so on and so on. So making sure the right levels of control are in there as well, right? Intune. Really, really powerful platform as well to stop accidental things or on purpose at times, things going from one app to another. So it doesn't take a lot of work within Intune if a device is enrolled, Windows or otherwise, iOS devices, to sort of say, okay, I'm happy for you to see the following information, but you can only transfer that between my managed apps. So from an office with a authenticated AD account into another office app with an authenticated AD account. So from email to Word, but you can't put that into WhatsApp or iCloud or whatever the case may be, right? Again, making sure you've got that level of control in terms of your security footprint, right? Azure information protection, protecting the documents themselves, right? Anecdotal, you could have someone effectively sort of, if AIP is in play, you could effectively have someone put as many files as they want onto a pen drive, fly from London to Singapore, buy a laptop, fly from there to the other side of the world in Australia if they need to, put the pen drive in, and it will still try and talk back to the cloud to say, I need to be authenticated before I allow you access to this file. And that file is then, encrypted indefinitely, right? So the idea there would be you can classify and say, the following information is only for these eyes. You can also then label things as secret, internal, external, confidential, etc. as well, and then be able to protect that file and at the same time have a detailed audit trail as to what's happened to that file. So that file has not been accessed, or someone has tried to access it with the wrong credentials and so on. Even if someone did have permission and their account's been breached, you can revoke access to those files from that person's account as well, which means you've got a high level of security and control across your Windows devices, your cloud apps, as well as then, the sort of things that you care about most, which is again, your data as well, right? So in terms of obviously how Power On platforms can help, access some of these services, we do a lot of work with organizations around trialing it, proof of concept, discovery workshops, as well as then kind of putting these things into production environments a lot of the time, right? In terms of where you start and how you keep on top of things, there are some resources I'll quickly show you guys now. They break down into the configuration manager side of things, also break down into the Windows 10 side of things, as well as in the cloud side of things with Intune as well, right? So if you give me one moment, I'll show you those now. And here you go. So within Microsoft Docs as well, you've got the Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager documentation. They've made it super simple to understand. and sort of access the right levels of information, right? You've got things around using the console, creating apps, deploying apps, upgrading things, really, really good user base, sort of use base, sort of scenarios and stuff you can run through device compliance and everything else. They've really made, a lot of the information quite simple and straightforward to consume as well, right? Also a really good place to stay up to date with what's up and coming, right? So you can learn about what's new, for example, right? Go through the various versions of Configuration Manager within your environment. So they've done their very best at updating, sort of massive sways of documentation and so forth. It just means it's a nice, easy place to go from an internal perspective to access these. I'll naturally share these links with the slides as well, right? The other one is around Windows 10. So one of the big challenges that you had in the past is around how to manage Windows, was around security, known issues, threats, problems, etc., etc. Sort of keeping up to date with a lot of those was always a challenge. But ultimately that's been mitigated by effectively a consolidated effort by Microsoft to put all of the information into one place, right? So you can go through and see the relevant bits and pieces for Windows in here. So if you're on 1803 still, you can look at the known issues that are in here, what issues have been fixed since, if you go to here, here, and here, right? And so on and so on. So it's a really good place to kind of get to grips with, any known issues with your environment. It's a consolidated place to obviously pick up on things as well as learn things a lot of the time. Look at resolved issues, look at known issues, notifications. It just means that, everything's in one place for you. And then fundamentally as well, the same is also true for things like Intune these days, right? So Intune itself goes through this iteration. So it's on 1906, I believe, currently. From an Intune perspective, but at the same time, going through the relevant bits and pieces from Microsoft documentation regularly, bookmarking these pages means you will stay up to date and not often get caught out by things like a new button, a new process, a new service, etc., etc. So there are some powerful resources, all available on microsoftdocs.com, right? They're constantly updated on a super regular basis, especially things like the Windows 10 side of things, and the Configuration Manager ones because of all the change and so forth with Endpoint Manager as well. So make sure you keep your eyes out for those. We're obviously here to take any questions as well, by the way, guys. I think you'll have space somewhere to type them out, and we're happy to answer those as we go. If you wanted to get in touch with us, here's the information available. As I said, we're happy to kind of look at sort of supporting you guys with anything you want to do. If you have any questions, queries, projects ongoing, help, support, and so forth, or just want to know a bit more, the information to get in touch is on screen, as well as through the organizers of this and your contacts within Power already, or through Microsoft as well. Thank you very much for spending your time with us this morning. We'll be taking any questions as we go. But once again, thank you very much for listening, and we'll be in touch.